They suspended Serenity Memorial Group's funeral director license in the state of Illinois on a Tuesday afternoon. 6 inspectors walked into the building I'd worked in for 28 years and found exactly what I told them they'd find. 6 caskets in the back storage room with internal return tags, chemical inventory that didn't match a single purchase order, and a filing cabinet full of bundled service contracts that charged families $14,000 for preparations that were never performed. Kyle Fenton, the man who told me I was a relic of the old school, was escorted out of his office by 2 investigators from the state board. He didn't say a word. I watched it from across the street, standing next to a woman named Holly Reeves, who was 24 years old and had been fired for asking the same questions I'd been asking for months. Between us, we had enough documentation to bury Serenity deeper than any casket they'd ever resold. Let me tell you how a scratch on a mahogany rail brought down a company that thought your grief was just another margin. My name is Dale Haskins. I'm 59 years old. I've been a licensed funeral director and master embalmer in the state of Illinois for 31 years. For 28 of those years, I worked at Briarwood Funeral Home in Elgin, about 40 miles northwest of Chicago. My father, Wayne Haskins, opened Briarwood in 1961. He was a World War II veteran who came home from the Pacific and decided the one thing every community needed was a place where families could say goodbye with dignity. He was right. Briarwood served Elgin for 60 years. I was the 3rd licensed embalmer to work there, after my father and a man named Gus Pelletier, who taught me everything about restoration that my father hadn't already covered. I started at Briarwood when I was 18, cleaning the preparation room and polishing brass fixtures. I got my funeral director's license at 22, my embalmer's license at 23. By the time I was 35, I was running the day-to-day operations while my father handled estate coordination and community relations. When he passed in 2004, my mother, Ruth, became the co-owner. I ran the business, she kept the books. We never missed a mortgage payment. We never had a complaint filed against us. We served over 3,400 families in 28 years, and I prepared most of those people myself. Let me tell you what that means, because most people have no idea what happens between the moment a body arrives at a funeral home and the moment a family walks into the viewing room and says she looks like she's sleeping. That phrase. I heard it thousands of times. It's the highest compliment in my profession, and it is never an accident. When a body comes to me, I have a window. Depending on the condition, I might have 6 to 10 hours of real work ahead. The first step is always assessment. I check for trauma, surgical intervention, decomposition, skin condition, vascular access points. Then, I begin arterial embalming. I use a formaldehyde-based solution. Cavalone Professional was my standard for 20 years. It preserves tissue, restores color, prevents bacterial degradation. The concentration matters. Too weak and the tissue softens within 48 hours. Too strong and the skin hardens, cracks, looks waxy. Every body is different. Every solution mix is different. I keep a preparation log for every case. Chemical type, concentration, injection points, drainage notes, cavity treatment, cosmetic work, clothing, casket assignment, serial number. 28 years of logs, over 3,400 entries. People think embalming is mechanical. It's not. It's the last act of care a person receives. I treated every body like they could feel what I was doing. I know they couldn't, but that discipline is what separates a professional from a technician. My father taught me that. He used to say, "Dale, the family sees the result, but the dead person is the client." I didn't understand that when I was 18. I understand it now. Gus Pelletier reinforced everything my father started. Gus was 71 when he retired, and he'd been embalming since the Korean War. He had hands like a surgeon and a memory like a filing cabinet. He could tell you the chemical mix he'd used on a case from 15 years ago just by looking at the family name in the log. He taught me about difficult restorations, the accident cases, the decomposition cases, the cases where the hospital sent someone 3 days late and the family still wanted an open casket. Gus never said no. He said, "Let me see what I can do." and what he could do was remarkable. I tried to carry that same standard forward. The hardest preparation I ever did was a 14-year-old boy named Daniel Reese, who died in a car accident in 2011. The damage was significant. His mother came to me and said, "I need to see my son one more time. I need him to look like Danny." I spent 11 hours. I rebuilt the left side of his jaw with mortuary wax and tissue builder. I used photo references his mother provided. When she walked into the viewing room the next morning, she touched his hair and said, "That's my Danny." She didn't cry until she left. I went back to the prep room and sat on the floor for 20 minutes. That's what this work is. It's not about chemicals and injection points and drainage. It's about giving a mother one last moment with her son that doesn't break her. It's about making sure the last image a husband has of his wife is one he can live with. You can't do that in 3 hours. You can't do that with diluted chemicals. And you can't do that if the person handling the body views it as inventory. For 28 years, I never cut a corner. Not once. Briarwood was a family funeral home. We had 4 viewing rooms, a chapel that seated 120, a preparation room with 2 tables, and a casket showroom on the lower level. We weren't fancy. We didn't have marble floors or a grand entrance, but we were clean, we were honest, and we were consistent. Families came back to us generation after generation. I buried grandparents, then parents, then uncles. Some families I'd served 3 times. They trusted us. That word meant something to me. It still does. My mother turned 74 in 2024. She'd been running the books alone since my father died, and she was tired. I understood that. What I didn't understand was why she took the meeting without telling me. Serenity Memorial Group is a corporate funeral chain based out of Columbus, Ohio. They operate 23 funeral homes across 6 states. Their business model is simple. Buy family-owned funeral homes in small to mid-size markets, keep the original name on the building for a transition period, then rebrand under the Serenity umbrella. They approached my mother through a broker in March 2024. By April, she'd signed a letter of intent. By June, the sale was closed for $1.8 million. I found out about the letter of intent 2 weeks after she signed it. I won't pretend I handled it well. I told her she was selling 60 years of our family's work to people who would gut it within a year. She told me she was 74 and couldn't do the books anymore, and that I'd never once offered to take over the financial side. She was right about the second part. I was right about the first. We were both too proud to say so. The contract had a clause that said Serenity would retain existing staff for a minimum of 12 months. It said the Briarwood name would stay on the building for at least 2 years. It said operational standards would be maintained at the highest level, consistent with Serenity Memorial Group's commitment to dignity and care. Every word of that clause turned out to be a lie. But it was a well-written lie, and my mother believed it. I don't blame her. She was 74 and tired, and she wanted to believe her husband's life work would survive in some form. It didn't. The transition was supposed to take 6 months. Serenity sent a regional vice president named Kyle Fenton to oversee it. Kyle was 36. He had an MBA from some online program and had previously managed a car dealership group in Toledo. He'd been with Serenity for 2 years. He had never handled a body. He had never attended a preparation. He had never sat with a family at 2 a.m, helping them choose a casket for their mother. But he had a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet told him Briarwood was underperforming on margin by 11% compared to Serenity's national average. Kyle's first week, he asked me to walk him through our operations. I showed him everything: the preparation room, the chemical inventory, the casket ordering system, the family consultation process, the chapel scheduling, the crematory partnership we had with a facility in Schaumburg. He took notes on a tablet the entire time. When we finished, he said, "Dale, I can see why this place has been around so long. You clearly care about the work, but caring doesn't scale. We need to find the leaks in the margin." I told him there were no leaks. He smiled like I'd said something quaint. "There are always leaks, Dale." He said my name a lot. I noticed that early. People who say your name constantly are either selling you something or managing you. Kyle was doing both. During that first week, Kyle also met with each staff member individually. 15-minute sessions in what used to be my father's office. He'd redecorated it already, took down my father's photos of Briarwood through the decades, and replaced them with a framed Serenity mission statement and a motivational poster that said, "Excellence is a habit." My father had served 3,000 families out of that office. Kyle had a poster about habits. After the individual meetings, 2 of our longtime employees resigned. Marcus Bell, who'd driven our transfer vehicle for 19 years, and Linda Cho, who'd handled family consultation for 11. Neither gave a specific reason. Marcus just told me, "I don't like the smell of this, Dale, and I don't mean the chemicals." Linda said even less. She cleaned out her desk on a Friday and was gone by Monday. Kyle replaced them within 2 weeks with people from Serenity's staffing pool. Younger, cheaper, no funeral industry experience. The first change came 2 weeks later. Kyle replaced our Cavalone Professional Embalming Fluid with a product I'd never heard of, Eterna Basic. I looked it up. It was a low-concentration formaldehyde solution manufactured in bulk for institutional use, nursing homes, medical schools, mass casualty storage. It cost $8 a gallon. Cavalone cost $34. Kyle ordered 12 cases of Eterna and told me to use it for all standard preparations. I told him Eterna wouldn't hold tissue past 72 hours in most conditions. I told him families who chose 3-day viewings would notice deterioration. I told him the color restoration was inferior. He looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Then he said, "Dale, the casket closes in 72 hours anyway. What are we preserving it for? A museum?" That was the first time I understood what I was dealing with. Kyle didn't disrespect the dead because he was cruel. He disrespected them because he genuinely couldn't see them as anything other than inventory. A body was a unit. A casket was a container. A grieving family was a conversion opportunity. His entire frame of reference was throughput. He'd spent his career selling Toyotas and managing service-based scheduling. Death was just another transaction with a higher average ticket price and a customer base that couldn't comparison shop because they were crying too hard to think straight. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table with the first Eterna bottle. I poured a small amount into a glass and compared it to the Cavalone I still had at home from my personal supply. The difference was visible. Cavalone is a rich amber with a consistent viscosity. Eterna Basic looked like weak tea. Thinner, paler, with almost no tinting agent. This was the fluid Kyle wanted me to inject into human tissue and expect to hold for 3 days. I photographed both samples side by side. I wrote the date and batch numbers on a piece of paper and included it in the photo. I didn't know why at the time. I was just a man who documented things. 28 years of habit. The second change was preparation time. Under my system, a standard preparation took 5 to 6 hours. Kyle introduced what he called Efficiency Protocol Bravo. Maximum preparation time, 3 hours, no exceptions. He posted the new schedule on the wall of the prep room with a laminated card that said, "Quality is efficiency." I stared at that card for a long time. 3 hours. I sat with that number for a long time. Gus Pelletier would have laughed. My father would have walked out. 3 hours wasn't enough. Not for a full restoration. Not for a body that had been in a hospital for 2 weeks with IV lines and surgical intervention. Not for an elderly person whose skin needed careful cosmetic work to look natural under viewing room lights. 3 hours meant shortcuts. It meant skipping cavity treatment on cases that needed it. It meant using pre-mixed cosmetic instead of custom matching skin tone. It meant rushing the hair. It meant hoping the family wouldn't look too closely. I started documenting the changes. Not because I was planning anything, just because it was my habit. I'd kept preparation logs my entire career. Every body, every chemical, every casket serial number, every note. Now I added a new column, deviations from standard. I noted the Eterna switch. I noted the time compression. I noted the cases where I knew the preparation was substandard, but was ordered to proceed anyway. The third change was pricing. Serenity replaced Briarwood's itemized pricing with bundled service packages. The old system was transparent. Embalming was one line, viewing room rental was another, casket was another, transportation was another. Families could see exactly what they were paying for. The new system had 3 tiers: Serenity Comfort at $6,800, Serenity Tribute at $10,200, and Serenity Premium at $14,200. The premium package included what Serenity called full memorial restoration, which, under my standards, meant a complete preparation with custom cosmetics, professional hairstyling, and detailed clothing presentation. Under Kyle's standards, it meant whatever the 3-hour window allowed. I saw the first complaint come in during September, a family named Ostrowski. They'd purchased the Serenity Premium package for their father, Edward, who'd passed at 86 after a long illness. Edward's daughter, Karen, came to the second-day viewing and said the cosmetic work looked waxy and unfinished. She said his hands looked wrong, the color was off, the skin texture wasn't right. She was correct. I'd seen Edward's preparation. The attendant who'd replaced me had spent 2 hours and 10 minutes on it. 2 hours and 10 minutes for an 86-year-old man who'd been on IV medication for 3 weeks. Kyle's response was to offer Karen a $200 service credit toward the aftercare package. That's how he handled a grieving daughter who noticed her father didn't look right. $200 on a $14,000 package. I raised this with Kyle directly. I said, "You're charging families $14,000 for a full restoration that you're not delivering. That's fraud." He didn't blink. He said, "Dale, it's a service package. The price reflects the total experience, the room, the flowers, the coordination, the aftercare kit. The preparation is one component." I said, "The preparation is the component the family is paying for. Everything else is furniture." He said, "Let's agree to disagree." I didn't agree, but I stayed. I stayed because I still believed I could protect the families from the worst of it. As long as I was in the prep room, I could at least make sure the work was done right, even if the chemicals were wrong and the time was short. I adjusted. I came in earlier. I stayed later. I compensated for Eterna by increasing injection pressure and adding supplemental cavity treatment on my own time. Kyle never noticed. He only looked at the spreadsheet. Then the fourth change came, and it was the one I couldn't work around. Kyle introduced rotation inventory. The idea was simple. When a family purchased a casket as part of a cremation package, meaning the casket was used for the viewing, then the body was transferred to a cremation container and the casket was returned to inventory. Serenity would clean the casket and resell it to the next family at full price, without disclosure. The family buying the casket would never know it had been used before. They'd pay $8,000 or $12,000 for what they believed was a new casket. It wasn't. I found out about rotation inventory on a Thursday afternoon in October 2024. I walked into the storage room and saw our facilities assistant, a kid named Trevor, removing the satin lining from a Hamilton Reserve walnut casket. I asked him what he was doing. He said Kyle told him to prep it for the Wexler viewing on Saturday. I said, "That casket was used for the Callaway service 2 weeks ago. I prepared Mrs. Callaway in it myself." Trevor looked at the floor and said, "I know, Mr. Haskins. Kyle said to clean it and reline it." I went to Kyle's office. I told him reusing caskets without disclosure was a violation of the FTC funeral rule. The funeral rule requires funeral homes to provide an itemized general price list and to disclose the nature of all goods and services. Selling a used casket as new is misrepresentation. Kyle leaned back in his chair and said, "Dale, it's not used. It's been in service for a viewing. There's no law against rotating display inventory." I said, "It's not display inventory. A family paid for it. A body was in it." He said, "The body was in it for 16 hours. The lining is replaceable. The casket is fine." I said, "The family paid $8,400 for that casket." He said, "And the next family will pay $8,400 for it too. That's how margin works, Dale. That was November 2024. I filed an internal objection in writing. Kyle acknowledged receipt and forwarded it to Serenity's regional compliance officer. The compliance officer's response arrived 2 weeks later. 3 sentences. Thank you for your feedback regarding inventory management procedures. Serenity Memorial Group's casket lifecycle program has been reviewed and approved by our legal and operations teams. No further action is required at this time. A casket lifecycle program. That's what they called it. Lifecycle. For a casket. I was terminated in December 2024. They called it a retirement. The timing was deliberate. December is the slow season in funeral services. Fewer families to notice the change. Kyle had learned that from the Serenity Operations Manual, the same manual that would later become evidence. Kyle threw an appreciation evening, catered by a local Italian place. White tablecloths in the chapel, which felt wrong to me, but nobody else seemed to mind. 30 people came, staff, a few Serenity corporate people who drove up from Columbus, and exactly 2 families who I'd served over the years. 2 out of 3,400. Kyle stood at the podium where I'd delivered hundreds of eulogies and called me a legend of the old school. He said Briarwood was ready for its next chapter. He said, "The future of death care is efficiency, compassion, and innovation." He used the word synergy once, in a funeral home, at my retirement party. The staff applauded. Most of them had been hired after the acquisition. The new prep attendant, a kid named Jason who didn't have an embalmer's license, was standing in the back eating a cannoli. He was my replacement. 28 years and 3,400 families got replaced by a kid with a cannoli and no license. I shook Kyle's hand because my mother was watching. She was sitting in the front row, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. I think she was starting to understand what she'd sold, but it was too late for that conversation, and neither of us had the words for it anyway. I walked out of Briarwood that night carrying a box, my personal embalming kit, my father's trocar, the one he'd used since 1961, with a worn wooden handle and his initials scratched into the steel, and 28 years of preparation logs, 3-ring binders with dated tabs, 3,400 entries, every chemical mix, every casket serial number, every scratch, every dent, every note I'd ever made about a body or a box. Kyle saw me carrying the binders and said, "Dale, you don't have to take all that old paperwork. We can shred it for you." I looked at him. He had no idea what he was offering to destroy. The first week at home, I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd worked 6 days a week for 28 years. Funerals don't take weekends off. People die on Christmas Eve and the 4th of July and the morning of their daughter's wedding. I'd been on call for nearly 3 decades, and now my phone didn't ring. I sat in my kitchen at 5:30 every morning out of habit, drinking coffee, listening to the quiet. My wife Carol had passed in 2019. The house was too big for one person. I thought about selling it. I thought about getting a dog. I thought about a lot of things that first month, but mostly I thought about Mrs. Calloway's casket. The Hamilton Reserve with the crescent scratch on the left rail. I'd documented that scratch for the insurance claim after delivery. I'd noted the serial number, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought kept turning. If they rotated that casket once, they rotated it more than once. 4 months later, in April 2025, I attended a visitation at Briarwood. Not as an employee, as a guest. Harold Webster, 81, had been a friend of my father's. His family chose Briarwood because they'd always used Briarwood. They didn't know it wasn't Briarwood anymore. I walked into viewing room B, and I saw the casket. Hamilton Reserve, walnut finish, brushed silver hardware, and on the left rail, about 6 inches from the head end, there was a scratch. A crescent-shaped mark about 1 inch long. I knew that scratch. I'd documented it. March 9th, 2024, Callaway, Edith M., Hamilton Reserve, Walnut. Serial number HMR-4421-W. Left rail crescent scratch from delivery, noted for insurance claim. That casket had been used for Mrs. Calloway's viewing 14 months earlier. Her family had paid for it as part of a cremation package. The casket was supposed to have been retired after the cremation transfer. Instead, someone cleaned it, relined it, and put it back in the showroom. And now, Harold Webster's family was paying full price for it. Again. I went home and opened my binder. I found the entry. Serial number HMR-4421-W, Calloway, March 9th. I pulled up the Webster obituary online. Visitation at Briarwood Funeral Home, April 12th. Same casket. 13 months apart, 2 families, full price both times. I started pulling more entries. I had serial numbers for every casket I'd ever used in 28 years. But the ones that mattered were the last 18 months, the period after the Serenity acquisition. I had 47 casket assignments from that period. I started cross-referencing them with public obituary records and the visitation dates I could verify. Within a week, I had identified 11 caskets that appeared to have been used in multiple services based on the timing patterns. 11 caskets at an average price of $9,200 each. That was over $100,000 in fraudulent casket sales from one funeral home in 14 months. I needed more than my logs, though. I needed someone inside. Margaret Kowalski was 55. She'd been the office manager at Briarwood for 12 years. She was still there after the acquisition because Serenity needed someone who knew the filing system. I called her on a Saturday morning. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dale, I can't talk about this on the phone." We met at a diner in Carpentersville. She ordered coffee and didn't drink it. "They rotate them every week," she said. "Kyle has a system. The caskets that come back from cremation transfers get tagged with a yellow sticker inside the lid. Trevor cleans them, relays the lining, and they go back to the showroom. I've seen the Hamilton Reserve at least 4 times in 2 months, the Ashford Bronze 3 times, the Wilmington Cherry twice. He doesn't even change the padding sometimes, just the outer satin." I asked her if she'd be willing to put that in writing. She shook her head. "I can't lose this job, Dale. I'm 3 years from retirement. My husband's on disability." I told her I understood. I didn't push. But I asked her one more question. "Is there anyone else who saw it and said something?" She looked at me and said, "There was a girl, an intern, Holly something. She lasted about 6 months. She asked too many questions about the chemicals and Kyle got rid of her." Holly Reeves was 24. She'd been enrolled in a mortuary science program at Worsham College of Mortuary Science in Wheeling. Serenity had offered internship placements at several of their Illinois locations, and Holly had been assigned to Briarwood. She arrived 3 months after I left. She lasted 6 months. I found her through the college's alumni network. She was working at a funeral home in Rockford. When I called, she was cautious. She'd signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of her termination. I told her NDAs don't cover fraud. She said she knew that in theory, but wasn't sure she wanted to test it. I told her what I'd found about the caskets. She was quiet. Then she said, "It wasn't just the caskets, Mr. Haskins." We met at a coffee shop in Schaumburg on a Wednesday afternoon. She was small, serious, wore her hair pulled back tight the way you learn to in mortuary school, nothing loose near the work. She looked like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was tired of holding it alone. Holly brought a folder. Inside were 14 photographs she'd taken on her phone during her time at Briarwood. The photos showed Eterna Basic embalming fluid being poured into Cavalone Professional bottles. The labels were different. The colors were different. Anyone who'd worked with both products would recognize the substitution immediately. But the families would never know. They'd see the Cavalone label on the prep room shelf and assume they were getting the premium product their $14,000 package promised. Holly told me the story. "I noticed the chemical swap in my 2nd month. The fluid was thinner. The color wasn't right. I asked a senior attendant and he said, Kyle switched suppliers for cost reasons. I said the tissue preservation was going to be worse. He said Kyle doesn't care about tissue preservation, he cares about cost per unit. I went to Kyle directly. I showed him the bottles. I said the concentration was too low for 3-day viewings. He told me I was an intern and I should focus on learning the business side. 2 weeks later, I was terminated. The reason on the form said, "Position eliminated." But the position wasn't eliminated. They hired someone else the next month. Holly had more than photos. She had notes from every preparation she'd assisted with during her 6 months. Dates, chemical lots, observations about tissue condition. She'd documented cases where the Eterna solution failed to hold properly, families who came for a second-day viewing and noticed discoloration that shouldn't have been there. In 2 cases, families had complained. Kyle's response, according to Holly, was to offer a partial refund and blame the hospital for delayed body release. Holly paused. She looked at her coffee. Then she said something I haven't forgotten. "Mr. Haskins, when I was in school, they taught us that embalming is a covenant. You're accepting custody of someone's person, their actual body. The trust that family places in you is absolute because they have no way to verify what happens behind that door." Kyle turned that trust into a profit center. He knew families couldn't check. He counted on them being too grief-stricken to ask questions, and the ones who did ask, like me, like the Ostrowski daughter, got brushed off or fired. She was 24. She understood the work better than a man with an MBA who'd been put in charge of it. I sat across from Holly in that coffee shop and realized we had something. Between my 28 years of preparation logs, my casket serial number database, Marianne's eyewitness account of the rotation system, Holly's photographs of the chemical substitution, and her preparation notes, we had a documentation trail that Serenity couldn't explain away. But I wanted to understand the scale before I moved. If this was happening at one Briarwood location, it was almost certainly happening at others. Serenity operated 23 funeral homes. If even half of them were running the same playbook, rotation inventory, chemical substitution, unbundled billing, the total fraud exposure would be in the millions. I spent 3 weeks building a spreadsheet. I used public obituary data, casket manufacturer catalogs, Serenity's published pricing from their websites, and my knowledge of standard funeral home operating costs. Conservative estimate for Briarwood alone: 40 caskets rotated at an average overcharge of $6,000 each, plus chemical savings of roughly $45,000 per year, plus the gap between premium package pricing and actual services delivered. Approximately $3,000 per premium client times roughly 180 premium clients in 14 months. Total estimated fraud at the Elgin location, approximately $720,000 in 14 months. That number made me sit down at my kitchen table. I set down my coffee and stared at the spreadsheet for a long time. $700,000 stolen from grieving families in one building. Families who were making the worst purchase of their lives, buying a casket for their mother, their father, their husband, and being systematically lied to about what they were getting. Then Kyle called me. He wanted to meet for coffee, just the 2 of us. Casual. I agreed because I wanted to see what he knew. We met at a Panera on Randall Road. Kyle was relaxed. He ordered a latte and a blueberry scone. He started with small talk. Asked about my mother. Asked if I was enjoying retirement. Then he leaned forward and said, "Dale, I heard you came to the Webster visitation, and I heard you were talking to some of the staff afterward, asking questions." I said, "I came to pay respects to Harold. He was a friend of my father's." Kyle nodded. "Sure, but someone said you were looking at the casket pretty closely, and you talked to Trevor for about 15 minutes. I said, "I noticed the casket, that's all." Kyle stirred his latte. "Dale, I respect what you did at Briarwood, but you need to understand that Serenity protects its operations. We have corporate counsel. We have non-disclosure agreements with former employees. If someone were to make unfounded claims about our practices, we'd have to respond, and that response wouldn't be pleasant." He let that hang. He watched me. I think he expected me to flinch. I didn't. I'd spent 30 years standing in rooms with dead people. A threat from a man who used to sell Toyotas didn't register the way he thought it would. I said, "Kyle, I'm retired. I don't have any claims to make. I just came to say goodbye to Harold." He relaxed. He finished his scone. He told me about Serenity's expansion plans, 2 new acquisitions in Indiana, 1 in Wisconsin. He seemed proud. He didn't realize he'd just confirmed that the playbook was being replicated. 2 more funeral homes, 2 more communities, 2 more buildings full of families who would be lied to about the caskets and the chemicals and the services they were paying for. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for 10 minutes with the engine off. The thing about Kyle's threat was that it told me 2 things. First, he was nervous. People who aren't worried don't make veiled threats over lattes. Second, he thought I was just an old man who'd noticed something and needed to be scared off. He didn't know about the binders. He didn't know about Holly. He didn't know about Marianne. He didn't know that the man he was trying to intimidate had spent 30 years documenting everything he touched, because that's what professionals do. He made the same mistake every antagonist in every story I've ever heard makes. He assumed the quiet person was the harmless one. I called an attorney. Raymond Garza practiced consumer protection and healthcare regulatory law in Chicago. He'd handled cases against nursing homes, hospice providers, and medical device companies. He'd never worked a funeral industry case, but he knew the FTC funeral rule cold. When I laid out what I had, the logs, the serial numbers, Holly's photos, Marianne's account, he sat back in his chair and said, "Mr. Haskins, do you understand what you're sitting on?" I said I had a pretty good idea. Garza explained the legal framework. The FTC funeral rule, codified at 16 CFR Part 453, requires funeral homes to provide consumers with an itemized general price list before any services are discussed. It requires separate disclosure of casket prices. It prohibits tying, forcing consumers to buy a package to get a single service. It prohibits misrepresentation of goods. Selling a previously used casket as new, without disclosure, was a textbook violation. Charging for full memorial restoration that wasn't performed was another. The chemical substitution, billing for Cavalone while using Eterna, was a third. Garza said, "The FTC can levy fines up to $50,000 per violation. If you've got 40 casket rotations, that's potentially $2 million in federal penalties from one location alone." But the real exposure is the state licensing board. Illinois regulates funeral directors and embalmers through the comptroller's office. Misrepresentation of services, substandard embalming practices, and failure to maintain proper records are all grounds for license suspension or revocation. He paused. And then there's the civil side. Every family that paid for a casket that was previously used has a fraud claim. Every family that paid for premium restoration that wasn't delivered has a breach of contract claim. If we can establish a pattern across multiple Serenity locations, we're looking at a class action. I told Garza I wanted to build the strongest possible file before filing anything. He agreed. We spent the next 6 weeks assembling the documentation. My contribution was the core. 28 years of preparation logs with casket serial numbers, chemical types, concentration ratios, and condition notes. The entries from my last 18 months were the most critical. They established the baseline of standard practices before the Serenity acquisition, and they documented the exact moment each practice changed. The Cavalone to Eterna switch had a date. The 3-hour preparation protocol had a date. The first casket I suspected of rotation had a date and a serial number. Holly's contribution was the smoking gun. Her 14 photographs showed Eterna basic fluid being transferred into Cavalone professional bottles. The metadata on the photos included timestamps and GPS coordinates, all from inside Briarwood. She also provided her 6 months of preparation notes, which documented tissue degradation patterns consistent with diluted embalming fluid. We reached out to 3 families. The Callaways were first. Edith Callaway's daughter, Patricia, lived in Hoffman Estates. When Garza explained that the casket her mother had been displayed in, the casket the family had paid $8,400 for, had been cleaned and resold to another family 6 weeks later, Patricia was silent for almost a full minute. Then she said, "My mother chose that casket herself. She went to Briarwood a year before she died and picked it out. She said the walnut reminded her of her grandmother's dining table." Patricia agreed to provide a sworn statement. The Websters were second. Harold's son Jim was an engineer in Naperville. When he learned the casket at his father's visitation had been used for at least one prior service, he said, "We paid $11,200 for that casket. You're telling me someone else's grandmother was in it 6 weeks before my father?" He agreed to provide a statement. The third family was the Wynns. Ton Wynn's wife Lynn had passed in January 2025 after a 2-year battle with pancreatic cancer. She was 57. The family had chosen the Serenity Premium Package at $14,200 because the brochure promised a dignified farewell with the highest standard of memorial preparation. The brochure had photographs of beautifully restored individuals in elegant caskets. Lynn's daughter, Mai, later told me that her mother had always been meticulous about her appearance. Lipstick every day, even during chemotherapy. The family wanted Lynn to look the way she would have wanted to look. At the first day viewing, everything seemed acceptable. But Mai came back the next afternoon and noticed something wrong. The skin around her mother's hands had begun to discolor, a grayish-purple undertone that shouldn't have been visible less than 48 hours after preparation. The cosmetic work on the face was holding, but the hands told a different story. Mai called Briarwood. The person who answered, Mai didn't remember the name, told her it was normal settling and that changes after 24 hours are expected. That was a lie. Changes after 24 hours are expected with Eterna Basic at standard dilution. They are not expected with Cavalone Professional at proper concentration. Cavalone holds tissue for a minimum of 5 days in most conditions. Mai had taken a photograph of her mother's hands on her phone. She'd kept it. At the time, she thought she was being paranoid. She told me she'd shown the photo to a friend who was a nurse, and the nurse had said, "That doesn't look right to me." But Mai didn't follow up. She was burying her mother. She had other things to deal with. It wasn't until Garza contacted her that she understood what the photograph actually showed. 6 weeks of work, 3 binders of documentation, 47 casket entries with serial numbers, 14 photographs of chemical substitution, preparation notes spanning 6 months from a mortuary science intern, sworn statements from 3 families, a spreadsheet calculating $720,000 in estimated fraud at one location over 14 months, and a legal brief from Raymond Garza citing 12 specific violations of the FTC funeral rule and 9 violations of Illinois funeral director licensing statutes. On a Tuesday morning in June 2025, Garza filed a formal complaint with the Illinois Comptroller's Office, Division of Professional Regulation, specifically the State Board of Funeral Directors and Embalmers. The same morning, he filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection, referencing the funeral rule violations. The State Board moved first. Under Illinois Administrative Code Title 68, Part 1250, the Board has authority to conduct unannounced inspections of licensed funeral establishments when a complaint alleges violations of practice standards. 2 inspectors arrived at Briarwood, now operating under the name Serenity Memorial Elgin, 4 days after the complaint was filed. They found everything. Every single thing I documented was there, waiting for someone with authority to walk in and look. The lead inspector was a woman named Dr. Catherine Webb. She'd been with the State Board for 19 years. Garza told me later that when Dr. Webb walked into the back storage room, she stopped moving for about 30 seconds. Then she turned to her team and said, "Document everything. Touch nothing until photographs are complete." In the back storage room, behind the main casket inventory, they found 6 caskets with yellow internal tags. The tags were part of Serenity's rotation tracking system, a label affixed to the inside of the casket lid indicating the date of last use, the name of the deceased, and the date of return to inventory. 6 caskets, 6 yellow tags. Each one represented a family that had paid full price for what they believed was a new casket. Each one had been used before, cleaned, relined, and resold. In the chemical storage room, inspectors found 12 cases of Eterna Basic, alongside 4 empty Cavalone Professional bottles that showed signs of refilling, residue inconsistency, label wear patterns, and cap seal disruption. Holly's photographs matched exactly. In the filing room, inspectors found Serenity's internal documentation for the bundled pricing system. The premium package contract language promised full memorial restoration, including professional cosmetic application, detailed hairstyling, and hand-finished presentation. The preparation logs maintained by Kyle's staff, sparse, incomplete, and entered in a different format than mine, showed average preparation times of 2 hours and 15 minutes. Full memorial restoration in 2 hours and 15 minutes is not possible. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of chemistry and anatomy. The state board issued an emergency suspension of Serenity Memorial Elgin's funeral director license, pending a full investigation. The building was ordered to cease operations immediately. All pending services were transferred to 2 independent funeral homes in the area. Kyle Fenton was personally served with a notice of investigation by the comptroller's office the same afternoon. He retained counsel through Serenity's corporate legal department. Serenity Memorial Group issued a public statement. The actions of an individual employee at one of our locations do not reflect the values or practices of Serenity Memorial Group. We are cooperating fully with the investigation and have placed the individual in question on administrative leave. An individual employee, one location. I read that statement sitting at my kitchen table with the same coffee mug I'd been drinking from for 20 years, and I thought about the compliance officer who'd written me that 3-sentence response about the casket life cycle program. Corporate knew. They had to know. The yellow tags were standardized. The rotation tracking system was uniform. The Eterna purchasing was centralized. This wasn't one rogue manager in Elgin. This was a business model. Kyle was just the one who got caught first. That's what they said. But the FTC complaint referenced Serenity's centralized purchasing system, the Eterna bulk orders, the casket tracking protocols, the bundled pricing templates. None of those came from Kyle Fenton's imagination. They came from Serenity's corporate operations manual. Garza had requested a copy through the state investigation, and when it arrived, it contained an entire section on inventory lifecycle management, corporate language for casket rotation. The manual had been distributed to all 23 Serenity locations. The FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection opened a formal investigation 3 weeks after our complaint. They requested documentation from Serenity Corporate. Serenity's general counsel attempted to negotiate a voluntary compliance agreement, essentially promising to fix the practices in exchange for no penalties. The FTC declined. When a company has a corporate manual instructing franchise locations to resell used caskets without disclosure, voluntary compliance is not sufficient. Patricia Calloway, Jim Webster, and Mine Nguyen filed civil lawsuits against Serenity Memorial Group in Kane County Circuit Court. Garza filed a motion to certify a class action on behalf of all families who had purchased caskets or premium service packages from Serenity Memorial Elgin during the 14 months of the rotation program. The estimated class size was 280 families. Holly Reeves filed a separate lawsuit alleging wrongful termination and retaliation. Her claim was straightforward. She was fired for questioning practices that the state board subsequently confirmed were illegal. The non-disclosure agreement she'd signed was void as a matter of public policy. You can't enforce an NDA that requires someone to conceal fraud. The Elgin Courier-News published the story on a Friday. The headline read, "They sold the same casket over and over." The article included quotes from Patricia Calloway, a statement from Garza, and a photograph of the Briarwood building with the Serenity Memorial sign above the door. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by the Chicago Tribune, WGN, and 3 national funeral industry trade publications. The National Funeral Directors Association issued a statement condemning the practices and calling for increased regulatory oversight of corporate funeral chains. Serenity's stock, they were publicly traded on a small exchange, dropped 14% in 2 days. Their CEO issued a video statement promising a comprehensive internal review of all operational practices across every Serenity location. 3 families in Indiana filed separate complaints with their state board, citing similar concerns. The Wisconsin location that Kyle had bragged about acquiring just months earlier announced it was pausing the transition indefinitely. Kyle Fenton never spoke to me again. I heard through Mary Ann, who quietly cooperated with the state investigation once she saw it was real, that Kyle blamed the facilities assistant Trevor for the casket rotation. He told investigators that Trevor had been acting on his own initiative, but the yellow tags in the caskets matched Serenity's corporate tracking system, and Trevor's employee handbook included instructions for inventory life cycle processing that came directly from the corporate operations manual. Kyle's fingerprints were on the policy, even if his hands weren't on the caskets. The state board hearing was scheduled for September. Garza said the hearing would likely result in permanent license revocation for the Elgin location and a referral for criminal investigation. The FTC case would take longer. Federal investigations always do. But the documentation was strong enough that Garza expected a consent decree with substantial penalties. I drove past Briarwood last week. The Serenity Memorial sign has been removed. The building is dark. The parking lot is empty. There's a "For Lease" sign in the window of what used to be the chapel. My father opened that building in 1961. He spent 40 years there. I spent 28. We served over 3,000 families between us. We never reused a casket. We never diluted a chemical. We never charged for a service we didn't perform. And now the building is empty because a man with an MBA and a spreadsheet decided that grief was just another margin to optimize. I still keep my preparation logs. It's a habit I can't break and don't want to. The last 18 months of entries are sitting in Raymond Garza's office as evidence. But the first 26 years are in my house, in the closet of my spare bedroom, in 3-ring binders with dated tabs. 3,400 entries, 3,400 families. I remember most of them. Not by name. Nobody remembers 3,400 names. But by the work. The difficult restorations. The cases where the family said she looks like she's sleeping, and I knew it was because I'd spent 8 hours making it so. Margaret Kowalski retired 3 weeks after the inspection. She never had to testify publicly. Her written statement was sufficient for the state board's purposes. She called me once, a few days after the Courier News article, and said, "I should have said something sooner, Dale. I watched those caskets go in and out of that storage room for months." I told her she'd said something when it mattered. I told her the written statement she'd provided was part of the file that made the inspection happen. She said, "I know, but I could have called you 6 months earlier." She was right, but I've learned that people move on their own timeline when it comes to these things. Fear is real. Mortgage payments are real. 3 years to retirement is real. I don't judge Mary Ann for the timing. I judge Kyle for creating the conditions that made her afraid. Holly Reeves went back to Worsham and finished her mortuary science degree. She'll be a licensed embalmer by next spring. She told me she wants to open her own funeral home someday. A small one, family-owned, no corporate chain, no efficiency protocols, no inventory life cycle management, just the work. I told her that's a good plan. 3 families called me after the news broke. The Callaways, the Websters, the Wynns. They didn't call to thank me. They called because they needed to talk to someone who understood what had been done. Patricia Callaway asked me if her mother's preparation had been proper, if I had done the work myself, if I had used the right chemicals, if Edith had been treated with dignity. I told her I had prepared Edith personally, used Cavalone Professional at the correct concentration, spent 6 hours on the work, and that Edith had looked beautiful. Patricia cried. She said, "At least that was real." That's the thing about what Kyle and Serenity did. They didn't just steal money. They contaminated memories. Every family that held a viewing at that building after the acquisition now wonders, was the casket new? Was the preparation real? Was the dignity they thought they were paying for actually delivered? Some of those questions have answers in my logs. Some don't. The ones that don't are the worst, because they'll stay open forever. I sat in my kitchen last night with my binder open to the last page I wrote as a Briarwood employee. December 14th, 2024. Lawrence, Gerald T., age 79. Cavalone Professional, 32-ounce arterial, standard cavity. Hamilton Provincial, cherry finish. Serial number HMP-2287-C. Hair styled by request with a left part. Glasses placed per family instruction. Wedding ring on left hand. Gray suit, blue tie, American flag lapel pin. I closed the binder. I don't work at Briarwood anymore, but I prepared Gerald Lawrence. I prepared him right. And no one, not Kyle Fenton, not Serenity Memorial Group, not any spreadsheet or efficiency protocol or inventory life cycle manual can take that away. The building on State Street is empty now. The caskets are gone. The chemicals are evidence. The viewing rooms are dark. But the work I did there, the 3,400 families I served over 28 years, that work was real. Every preparation, every chemical mix, every serial number in my log. Real. My mother called me 2 days after the Courier News article. She'd read it on her tablet at the kitchen table, the same table where my father used to spread out his paperwork on Sunday mornings. She didn't say much. She said, "I'm sorry, Dale." I said, "It wasn't your fault, Mom." She said, "I sold it to them." I said, "You sold a building. They broke the covenant." We sat on the phone in silence for about a minute. Then she said, "Your father would have been proud of you." That's the only time in this whole process that I came close to losing my composure. Kyle Fenton called grief a margin. I called it the last thing we owe each other. One of us was wrong. The state of Illinois agreed with me.